Shalom, it's Marah Lisa with Marah Shelley Village. I am shooting this video today to share my plan for African American literature. I shared this book right here, African American Literature, in my grade 6 language arts or English video, and even prior to that, I have been asked lots of questions about what I'm doing for African American Lit. I've been tagged quite a few times on social media as well, so I figured I would just share. One of the things that I want to convey is that history and language arts or English, they go together. They're kind of complementary subjects, just like math and science are, right? So sometimes I use my language arts or my English time to introduce certain things that I want my students to learn about in a historical way before I'm ready to touch on it in depth in history class. All right, or you can complement them and have them side by side. What they're learning in English is also what they're learning in history, and they're seeing it in two different content areas, okay? So because I do so many different things in our English time, there is no way I could get through this whole book in a year. If I was only using this book for my literature or my language arts time, then I would. So it just depends on your style and how you like to do things. Language arts is my niche. It's my thing, if you will. So our homeschool heavily leans that way. For some other moms, their homeschools are more science-brained or more math-brained. But I am definitely way more language arts and history-brained. And so the majority of our studies and our school day, they lean that way. So because of that, I tend to do lots of things in that time, and I wouldn't just purchase this textbook and use it all the way through. Not that you can't, because you can. It just wouldn't be something that I would do. So let me get to the table of contents and get to my plan here. So this particular book, it is published by Holt. They do have it on grade 6 level. I am contemplating using this text 2 years in a row. I explained that in a previous video. There are certain things that I definitely want to use for grade 6. But once I got done, since I'm not only using this, I still had a good deal of content left, which I might decide to use in grade 7. That is to be determined. This book is categorized into 4 different units, and they're all historical eras. So Unit 1, From Africa to the New World, Prehistory to 1750. Unit 2, The Search for Freedom, 1750 to 1865. Unit 3, Challenges and Changes, 1865 to 1945. And Unit 4, Building a New Identity, 1945 to present. So for us, we've spent a lot of time in the era that is considered Unit 1 in this book, this prehistory to 1750. We spent a lot of time in this era in Africa, okay? So I'm not going to spend too much time in literature from here, but there are a few things I do want to pull. In Unit 2, we spent a lot of time in 1750 to 1865 in history in previous years, speaking about colonialism, imperialism, and America as it comes to be what the country that we know it is today. What we haven't spent a lot of time on, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. I have spent a lot of time in Unit 3, Challenges and Changes, 1865 to 1945. We've studied history up to 1965 American history. So what my students haven't had is American history post 1965, except for just what is, in contemporary culture. So I am loving Unit 4, which they have classified as 1945 to present, but for us, we be focusing more on 1965 to present, because there are things that I would like to introduce to my students historically this coming school year but I want to do it in a literary way because I'm going to wait to tackle some of these topics in history 2 years from now, which I've chosen to wait till grade 8 to study lots of that history for a particular reason. But there are certain things that I would like to expose them to now, and I'm going to choose to do that through literature so that I can go more in depth in history when I'm ready to do that when they're a little bit older. Okay, so let's get started with my plan and what I'm going to be doing. For a lot of people who tag me in social media or who ask me privately, email, inbox, etc., like what are some good things to read? What are some good like topics and content to kind of go over? I am hoping that as I share this plan, you'll hear some of those things. Lots of the material that is in this book doesn't just exist in this book. You can Google it and find some of these stories and legends and interviews, or you can get on YouTube. So I'm hoping that by me sharing it, you'll hear things that, oh yeah, I can plug this into our history studies because we're going to be doing that era, we're going to be talking about that person, etc. If you want to put it into your literary studies, you have that opportunity. And if you want to follow me, get the book and do exactly what I'm doing or some version of it, awesome. One of the reasons that I've chosen this text is because in 6th grade, I want to start exposing my students to essays, letters, short stories on the contemporary side, and on the more ancient or middle age side, I want to expose them to epics and legends, folklore, and African proverbs. So they're familiar with a little bit of that with our African study, but I wanted to kind of dig deeper and have them understand that content in a literary way. Okay, so without further ado, we are going to be reading in the prehistory to 1750 era. We're going to be reading a poem by Countee Cullen. And I'm going to give you the name of it so you can look for it if you want. It's called Heritage. We're also going to be reading a poem by Naomi Long Madgett. It's called First Man. And of course, this is all talking about Africa, our beginnings, and us being the cradle of civilization and the origin of human life. All right, and then we're going to move into an epic of Old Mali. I believe it's pronounced Sundiata. I've read this to these students when they were 3rd grade, I believe, in the storybook form. So shout out to Heritage Box. They also sent me a copy as well of Sundiata, and I was able to read it to my younger kids this past school year. Very, very good epic. But this year, I want them to read it and not just appreciate the story value, but I want them to, give me some literary analysis and some inference and evaluate and assess what's going on with the text. All right, we're going to go through several proverbs as we learn about various oral traditions throughout the many, many countries that exist in Africa, and we'll be doing some comparing and contrasting to what does that sound like for us. There are so many things that are familiar. We, obviously being African Americans, we have some of those things a part of our culture. We are very close friends with Afro-Caribbeans and Afro-Latinos or Latinas, and I'll be comparing and contrasting, like, what does this sound like to, Mr. So-and-so? What does this sound like to us or our family or to Granny or to, Auntie so-and-so? Because lots of those oral traditions that we see in Africa actually make their cross across the water, and they exist in other cultures and groups that are of African descent. So we'll be having that conversation as well. All right, some folktale. We will be reading A Spider's Bargain with God. I believe we've read a few folktales before, but definitely not for literary value. So I definitely want to give them that And then they will be reading an autobiography, all of this in this book again, from the narrative of the life of Equiano. That is going to conclude what we read in the prehistory to 1750 time. So moving on to Unit 2, Search for Freedom, 1750 to 1865, we are going to begin with a short story. The short story is called Poetry and Politics, and it is by Charles Johnson. Then we're going to really analyze 4 Negro spirituals. These Negro spirituals have some origin and some root in what is known as the Hebrew Scriptures. Some call it the Old Testament, some call it the Tanakh. Nonetheless, these spirituals have their origin there. So we'll just be talking about these spirituals. We'll listen to them. The majority of them have memorized two of these spirituals just in our history studies for the past 2 years. But the other 2, I've talked about them, but we haven't learned the songs, and we definitely haven't analyzed them. So we'll be doing that. We'll be talking about why did the enslaved Africans brought to America and other shores, why would they still have some type of memory or recall of these scriptures, and why would they sing the way that they sang those songs, and why would they connect the servitude and the bondage that they knew about in the scriptures to what they were experiencing in America. All right, next up, we will be reading an autobiography from the incidents in the life of a slave girl. So I wanted them to read at least 2 autobiographies or excerpts of autobiographies this year, one from a female, one from a male, and be able to compare and contrast those lives. That is going to conclude Unit 2. Now moving into Unit 3, Challenges and Change, 1865 to 1945. So we're going to pick up with a poem. It is called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. At about this time, I started to add in, what's the word I'm looking for? I started to add in, visual arts. Them studying either the photography or the sculptures or the artwork of particular artists, especially artwork that is paired with major poetry pieces, essays, etc. All right. Then we're going to go into an essay that is called How It Feels to Be Colored. Let me tell you who that's by in case you want to pull that for yourself. It is by Zora Neale Hurston. That was one of my goals this year, was to introduce my students to Zora Neale Hurston. We can't go too deep in her work until they're at least 8th grade, but I can introduce her. They are aware of her from our history studies. We talked about her literary value to the African American community during the rise of the Harlem Renaissance, but they have not actually studied her work. So they know who she is and why she added value to the Black community, but they don't know what she actually wrote. So we'll also be learning a little bit about Florida, obviously where she's from, and the dialect there. Okay, they will be learning about Gullah Geechee life in part, not a whole lot, but I will bring it up, and I'll be cross-referencing that with the dialect that we hear in Florida as we learn about Zora Neale Hurston, and we'll be doing a little bit of phonology and linguistic study to find out, yeah, we hear a little English, but we hear another language too. What's that language? Where did that come from? Did they learn that here? Are they bringing that from Africa? Did that language exist before they got to West Africa, etc.? Okay, where else? Okay, then we're going to be reading a short story called The Richer, the Poorer. That was another one of my goals, was to have them read at least two short stories, one by a female author, one by a male author, and be able to compare. The Richer and the Poor is by Dorothy West. And then we'll be learning a speech. So I do have some memory work or some recitation work for my sixth graders. Some of their recitation work is in other subjects, but for this particular subject, I would like them to be able to recite a portion of a speech. So they'll be reading We Too Sing America. Let me tell you who's that by really quickly. By Duke Ellington, and it is a speech, and they're very familiar with him and his work, so they'll get a kick out of that. And then that's going to conclude the time from 1865 to 1945, or Unit 3 in this book, and then we're going to move into Unit 4, Building a New Identity, 1945 to present. We're going to start with a short story. Let me flip there and tell you. It is called The First Day by Edward P. Jones. And then we're going to read two autobiographies. I was really looking for two autobiographies in this era of time, because I kind of, again, want them to get used to hearing about these figures that are post 1965-ish before we go into this history time 2 years from now. At least some of these people and some of the works that we're talking about will be familiar to them. So we are going to be reading an excerpt from Black Boy, all right, by Richard Wright. And we'll also be reading an excerpt from the autobiography of Malcolm X. Okay, and then they'll be doing some compare and contrast work there as well. The next thing that we're going to read is a column. I was very excited to see some periodical work in this text. It really made it worth it for me to just introduce them to work like that. Let's see, last year in literature class, we read two books by Walter D. Myers. One was called Darnell Rock Reporting, where we learned about periodicals and how to write them. And then the other was called The Cruisers, where we learned about newspaper articles and how to write and critique them as well. So I was very excited to see a column so they can see this exist in literature class. Let's see, who wrote this? Give me 1 second to flip over. Oh, I know why I chose this too, yes. Okay, it's called Study on Young Blacks Reveals More Than Style. All of my students are African American. The majority of them are male, so I tend to lean that way. This was a really, really good article just about black culture, or a column rather, about black culture. It was published in 2007, so not too long ago, and it just has to, it's really, really good with teaching them about like typecasting and stereotypes and generalizations, and how the blacks that tend to look like a stereotype by their outward appearance and their expression of their clothing tend to not be exactly that stereotype. That whole not judging a book by its cover. And it's a beautiful, beautiful read, beautiful piece. I can't wait to go through this with them. All right, so we're reading that column. Let me tell you who it's by. It's by Dawn Turner Trice, in case you want to look that up for yourself. Okay, and then we're going to conclude Unit 4 with some lyricism. I tend to teach them lyricism every single year in terms of either poetry or a book that's written in verse. Like, for example, this year they're reading Garbage Choice, written by Nikki Grimes, and that's written all in verse. And let's see, my younger kids are reading other works by Nikki Grimes with the title My Man Blue. to give you an idea. But I really wanted them to study like the lyrics of songs, more contemporary. It's not quite 21st century, but it's new enough. So the first is by Stevie Wonder, Living for the City. And I really like, I'm going to read a few of them off to you, but I really like some of the questions and the connections they're having the children to make with this title. I know this song, I know it by heart, I love it, but I love the analysis that's here. So I'm going to give you an idea. First, they give us some historical context, right? He mentions Mississippi. Mississippi has one of the highest poverty rates in the United States. So, of course, we'll have that conversation. But here goes some questions. How would you describe the boy's parents and their values? What does line 14 tell you about the sister's character? What does the simile, like a haystack needle, tell you about his job search? Why is it this way? And so in history this year, we talked about the idea of last hired, first fired, where that came from, and how that looked on the African American community and if it was still at work today. So I will bring lots of those things that we learned up in relation to this particular song. Here's another question. Bear in mind the young man's childhood as you read about his adult life in lines 21 through 24. How might this story be a form of social commentary? And it has other questions. I won't read them all. And it gives a small bio of Stevie Wonder. And he's still alive. That's one of the first things the children ask me when I pull out somebody from history. They're like, Mariah, Lisa, is this person still alive? And they just love when the person is still alive. So I'll be very excited to say yes to that question this school year. All right, next up is Don't Believe the Hype by Public Enemy. All right, love the questions here. I love the historical context. Listen to this. The term public enemies was first used by the Chicago Crime Commission in 1930 to identify the city's top criminals. It is now used for perceived threats to society. So, like, I want to get them to thinking, what do you think this group of African American men were trying to say when they called themselves Public Enemy? And the lyrics are just great for literary analysis, and I can't wait to do that. They even threw in some vocabulary for me. So, epitome is the word. Then we're going to go into The Evil Men Do by Queen Latifah. The phrase, the evil that men do, comes from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And then it gives that line, and then we go into that. We are reading 3 of Shakespeare's works this year. And so I'll make that connection there during class. And then we're going to end with Tupac Shakur. I taught a course this past school year called Black History Bios, where we learned about, one of the weeks we learned about African American rebels. And Assata Shakur was one of our figures. And so the students, that was one of their favorite weeks by far. And they love Assata Shakur. They're always bringing her up and talking about her. So I did mention Tupac Shakur during that lesson, but we're going to go into more depth, obviously, with learning about this song. So In the Depths of Solitude by Tupac Shakur, we're going to end with that. It has some vocabulary here. I like the literary analysis as well. One of the skills practice is that they're going to talk about the song, give me what the message was, and then rate how effective that song either is or was and why. I love that. And then, of course, there's just traditional reading comprehension and writer's workshop. Okay, that is how, and that is what, I'm using for African American literature in terms of the smaller pieces: essays, poems, proverbs, excerpts of biographies or autobiographies, short stories, letters, columns, etc. The reason that I don't use a text like this as a standalone for the whole year is because I do believe that children should be reading full pieces of literature, not just excerpts and poems and essays. Even though I do find that very valuable, which is why I have this book and why I just shared that plan, I still feel like they should be reading an entire novel and being able to connect with that, being able to compare and contrast that with another novel, either written by the same author or about the same topic or has the same theme, etc. And I feel like if we just read this, they're only getting snippets and pieces and they're never reading fuller works. So that is my spiel for that. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it informative or helpful in any way, please like, share, subscribe. And you can also visit my blog, www.marashali.com. Until next time, shalom.